Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of Nelson's Corner. We're going to be continuing on with the engine card game. This is part number 11. So in the last video, if you recall, we spent some time working on attached properties. I do believe Nelson has just a little bit more that he would like to get in place, as well as correct a bug. Am I right there, Nelson?
Yeah, there's a
What
bug.
are you doing putting bugs into things? I've seen this bug, too. I can't believe you didn't catch
Yeah,
this.
it was really dumb. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to write a test that proves the existence of this bug, and then we're going to fix the bug and watch the test go green.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm just going to go ahead and reuse this code right here.
Well, before even writing the test out, I mean, just kind of give us an idea of what exactly. I mean, don't go and show the bug, but what's the idea?
Well, the problem is that early on, well, even their entire name, I attach properties, it kind of gives you the idea that you should be able to attach a new property onto a game object that doesn't already have that property exposed.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, if you attach a property onto a game object that doesn't have that property already exposed, I mean, if you attach an interceptor, what will be returned out will always be null, which isn't the behavior that we want.
Right. Okay.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a third game object, or a fourth game object, or a third in this group, a fourth in general, called game object 4, and he's going to implement inherit from game object. So he's not going to actually do anything. We're not going to implement the iProperty interceptor method, or interface. Instead, we'll just leave him blank, and then we're going to attach an interceptor, such as this guy, the game object 3 to him, and that should make it return false. But we'll see in a second that that's going to be a problem.
Okay.
So we're going to say we're going to write a new test, and we're going to call this property interceptor attached to game object that. This is getting ridiculous. Property interceptor can add new properties to game object. That's better.
Okay.
I generally really do prefer, at least, I mean, even if it does get ridiculous, just because when you're going over this stuff.
Right. It makes it a lot easier to see exactly what it is you're testing.
Right. So the first thing, we're going to create our empty game object, which, remember, is game object 4. Then we're going to go ahead and create our repository, because we need this guy. Really. There we go.
Would you like for me to paint some letters onto your keyboard?
And then we're going to register him. But actually, we're also going to create the interceptor over here, just to keep things consistent. And game object 3, which is an awesome name for something. We should probably change those at some point. Then we're going to go register him as well into our engine. Then we're going to create our attached properties and pass in our repository. Then we're going to attach a interceptor to our empty. So empty.id, and then our interceptor is going to be interceptor.id. So at this point, whenever I get the canFly attribute out of empty, he should return a value that should be false. Mm-hmm. If you see right there on the interceptor code.
Exactly.
So I'm going to save our property equals attached properties.get, pass in canFly property, get the game object ID, which is going to be empty.id. And we're going to say property should not be null. And then we should say property dot canFly should be false. So let's go ahead and run this test. Append it to our session. And I'm just going to run all of them, just because they're short. And we see that expected a non-null value but found null. So we see that property.should.be null is failing, which is an issue. So yeah, so there's our bug, and there's the code that we can use to prove whether or not we've actually resolved the bug, which is the nice thing about unit testing.
Exactly. Now let's jump over there to it, because it's pretty funny, actually.
Well, actually, no. What I'm going to do is I'm going to debug this. Because
Okay.
this is because if I didn't know where the bug was already, this is what I would do.
Yeah, true.
So I'm going to step into this method and step into that method. We're going to get the key. We're going to get the provider. So now we have the proper provider. I'm going to step into .get. I'm going to step forward, and boom. There's our problem.
It's doing exactly what you told it to do.
Well, that's the thing about bugs. I mean, computers will not do anything that you don't tell them to. And unfortunately, I instructed the computer to do something stupid.
Exactly.
So the issue is, if you remember, if we attach an interceptor that intercepts a property that the game object we're attaching ourselves to doesn't already expose to that property, we create an empty property provider and let game object be null. And method will also be null in this case, so remember that. So instead what we can do is we can say answer equals game object does not equal null, and then throw on a question mark, and then throw on a thingy. So now what's going to happen is if game object isn't null, we'll do what we did before. If it is null, all we're doing is setting answer to null. And the cool thing about that is that's still going to allow our interceptors to actually go through and change whatever they feel they want to change.
Right.
So to prove that it's been fixed, I'm going to go ahead and run this test again. And it still fails. Nice. That wasn't expected, by the way. So now let's figure out why that doesn't work. And I hit F10 instead of F11. But this is the nice thing about having debuggers and unit tests.
Especially as your code becomes much more complex.
Right.
Like this.
So our answer is null. And our interceptors, we have one interceptor. And if we go ahead and step into that, we'll have interceptor get game object is null, current is null, that's fine. And that's going to return this. Game object ID is going to be ooh. Well, that's another interesting thing. So basically, the game object being null is actually not what we want. We still want to know what game object we're attaching this property to, because the attached property code still needs to know it, or still needs to have a proper reference in order to get the ID of it.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to do is we're going to close out of this, and we're going to make one little change, or two little changes. We're on our constructor that doesn't take in a method info. We're still going to take in an iGame object. And we're still going to set that to our game object field. And then instead of this predicating on game object, we're going to predicate on method. So if method is null, then don't invoke it. And that actually makes a lot more sense if you look at the next line and everything. And then finally, the last change we have to make is going to be over here on attached properties, where we actually instantiate this. And so now we also have to pass in the game object that we're intercepting. And unfortunately, this actually needs to be a reference to the game object that we're intercepting, which requires that we do access our repository and say get game object by ID and pass in our game object ID, which, if you remember, is passed in as the first parameter to attach interceptor. So then I'm going to run this again. And
Much
yes.
better. Cool.
And just make sure I didn't break anything. Everything still works.
Okay.
So yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, so now that we have that done, there's one more thing that our attached properties class needs to do, and that, unfortunately, that's actually going to introduce another dependency that our attached properties has on other code, because when properties are retrieved, they're going to be cached, and when they're invalidated, and if they're different, then the event is going to be fired saying that this property on this game object has changed, and that's very important that attached properties is responsible for telling that change to the world, so that your WPF code or your Unity code or whatever knows to update some sort of property.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to the on notify property change interface in WPF, but it's better because it doesn't require that you write a bunch of stupid code. It's all just handled by attached properties.
Okay.
And the interface we're going to be depending on is going to be the iEvent publisher, which is very straightforward. So let's go ahead and grab an iEvent publisher. And so yeah, so now we have an event publisher. Now we can fire off events. Also, now what we need to do is we need to have a cache. So let's go ahead and create a cache real fast. Private read-only dictionary of type property key, and I attach property. And we're just going to call this cached values. And then we're going to go ahead and instantiate him in the constructor. And now we have a place to stick our cached values.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead and hide that for now so we have more screen real estate. And I'm going to delete that because that's irrelevant. So our cached values are going to mainly come into play on the get method. This guy right here, where we're going to get the property. We're going to call this new property, or new result. That's a better name. Property is awkward to type. And then we're going to stick them in there. And then we're going to say cached result equals cached values using the property key that we created above. So now we have the new result and the cached result. And we can go ahead and say if new result is null and cached result is null, then return null. If new result is not null and new result equals, and remember we the only thing that attached properties are required to implement is an equals method that takes in another attached property. That's what we're using that here. So we can say if new result equals cached result, then just return out new result. I mean, you might as well. New result or cached result is irrelevant. We don't need to change anything. Now, if we get to this point, we know that something has changed. We have a different result for this property. So we can go ahead and say cached values key equals new result. And then we have to publish out an event. And we don't have any events actually in existence at the moment. So let's go ahead and create the event that we're going to need to fire off. I'm going to create a new namespace called events, and then I'm going to drop in a property changed event. And the property changed event is going to, we're actually going to have two of these guys. The first one is going to be non-generic. So he's just going to say, he's going to have the iAttach property version of new value. So public game object ID, which is going to be game object ID, obviously. This is the game object that the property is changed on. Public type, the property type of the property that we changed. And public iAttached property, new value. And get that. And then generate a constructor that brought everything back in. And then, of course, I'm not actually implementing iEvent. So I'll go ahead and do that. So this is going to be fired whenever anything is changed, essentially. So then we can attach stuff in our code and things. So now that we have our event created, we can go ahead and publish it by publishing a new property changed event, passing in the game object ID, the property type, which is going to be something, property type up there, obviously, and then the new value is going to be the new result. And then finally, once we've notified everybody that we've changed a property, we can go ahead and just return out our new result. Sounds good?
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So now that we have that get method, we also have these invalidate methods that we need to deal with. And that's because whenever an object is, a new property interceptor is attached onto a property or onto a game object, we're going to want to invalidate it to say that, okay, now we want to go and get all of the new values that we might have created for this particular game object. So we use the invalidate method for that. And that's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to grab out all of our property providers, And remember, this is based off game object ID, not on the actual property type. So we're invalidating every property type on this game object ID. So the first step is to get all of our property providers for this game object. So we'll just use the providers by ID, and then try get value. The game object ID as the key out to providers, and if that failed, we can go ahead and throw a new key not found exception, just because you're doing something stupid and you should stop. Then we're going to go ahead and loop over all of these providers. And then we're going to say we're just going to call the get method. We're not, because the get handles the invalidating. We're not going to use the return type. We're just going to want the invalidating behavior. So we're going to get on our property type, which is going to be provider dot key dot property type, and then our game object ID, which is going to be just game object ID. And we don't need that. So that's that method, and then this method is actually just going to be even easier because we're invalidating based off a property type and a game object ID. So let's go ahead and just do property type, game object ID, and that's done. I do want to point out something that I did stupid.
Oh boy.
Well, if you look at these two signatures, one has a game object ID as the first parameter, the second one has a type as a first parameter, and that's just nasty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse these parameters real fast. So I just moved the game object ID to the left and the property type on the right, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the same to our interface. I don't know why I did that. But yeah, so just remember, switch out the game object ID or the property type, or it doesn't really matter. The code will work either way. It'll just be less confusing and more standard.
Right.
So yeah, so those are our invalidate methods, and we pretty much added on our cache and our publisher. So yeah,
the bug's been fixed. So that pretty much wraps up attached properties, right?
I mean, yeah.
I mean, at this point, we're really ready to move on to the event system, right?
Yeah, we can go ahead and finish that out. But as far as attached properties, this should be it, unless there are any more bugs that I'm too stupid to have found.
God, Nelson. I'm going to smack you, boy. All right, well, let me ask you this. Do you want to jump right into events from here, or do you want to keep that separated in videos?
I kind of want to keep it separated just to keep things cleaner.
Yeah, that works for me. I don't have any problems with occasionally having shorter videos. Awesome. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, we will go ahead and bring this video to a close. So we will be... Never mind. Yeah, all right, well, we'll be back with the events video. Thanks a lot, guys. All right, so you thought we were going away. Just kidding. Actually, as we did indeed conclude this video, Nelson discovered a few things that needed to be addressed real fast before we moved on to another video. And the last thing I wanted to do was to put this in a 1 minute to 5 minute video. Isn't that right, Nelson? Who had suggested we should do such a thing? What do we want to fix, Nelson?
Well... I mean, I do remember myself saying that there was going to be a genericized form of this event.
Right.
But then we ended up not doing that. Not only that, we also broke all of our tests, which is pretty impressive. Because we introduced a new argument into our parameter to the constructor of our attached properties. Now, every time we instantiated it in our tests, they're completely broken. Right. So let's go ahead and fix those two things really quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another property changed event. This one's going to be generic. And that's just, stuff and things. Property changed. I'm going to, because this is actually the same class name as the one that we just did, I'm going to add a little tick mark at the end of it just to denote that it's a generic class. Or it's the generic version of this class. And then it's going to be generic. And then it's going to implement iEvent. And then it's going to have a generic type constraint. That T property is an attached property. Then it's going to have a constructor, and the constructor is going to take in a game object ID. It's also going to take in a T property. What do we call that guy? New value. And then we can also just throw on a type, property type, even though we really don't need to. Then I'm also going to set all these guys to private. I'm going to import the namespace. I'm probably going to move that up one just to make more sense. And then set property type to type of tProperty. So here's the genericized form in this event. And the problem that we will now face is how do we fire off an event when we only have the property type at runtime and not compile time? There's no way that we're actually going to be able to instantiate this class through static code. We have to use reflection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say event type, and this will make sense in a second, is type of property changed, empty generic, make generic type, property type. So basically what we've done is we've already kind of talked about this syntax. We've taken the generic.
You almost got it. You can do it.
We have taken
Genericized?
the genericized generic type.
Very good.
And we've made it generic.
Yes.
With the make generic type method.
Awesome.
By passing in property type into the first thing. So yeah, that's this kind of stuff you can do with the CLR as opposed to the JVM that doesn't have any concept of generics at runtime because it's dumb.
Okay, so, Nelson, no attacks.
Now let's go ahead and publish this event. Let's go ahead and say activator dot create instance, pass in event type, and then we're going to have to pass in as arguments all of our parameters eventually. Really, there's no clean. Oh, there it was. It was just the screen was so small I didn't see it. I knew it was there, but so yes. Now we can just go ahead and pass in the argument list or parameter list that I already forgot. Game object ID and new value. So it's going to be game object ID and new result. And these both have to be cast to objects, otherwise it's going to complain or not. Really, what's wrong with you? Oh, I'm stupid. This has to be cast to an iEvent. There we go. So that's that. The second thing we need to do is we now need to fix our unit tests, which are now all broken. So what we could do is we could say null on all of this, just like we did with the repository in a few instances. But this will actually just create, because this actually, the class does use that object, it'll still fail miserably. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to create a little mock event publisher class inside of our, well, let's just stick it in our root tests namespace so that we can reuse it whenever we need to test events. So I'm going to call this event publisher stub, and it's going to implement iEvent publisher, and it's going to implement all the members. And then actually all it's going to do is it's going to have a public list of iEvent, no, not you, of iEvents that have been published. And we'll use this at some point later to actually test which events are being published. Oh, I'm sorry, Jason, I have to do this. Just give me a sec. I can't have a public list. That's disgusting. Public IEnumerable of iEvent published events. Return.
You know what else is disgusting?
List. Huh.
Those underscores.
I like my underscores. And now that we can make this read only, and then we can go ahead and publish. We'll just say published events.add event.
Oh, come on. I wasn't able to pull more emotion out of you than that.
Well, we've had this discussion.
I know that. I was just trying to harass you.
Underscore's the wave of the future.
Whatever. Okay. Yeah, tell Microsoft that.
Well, I mean, if they even followed their own coding conventions.
That's true. Well put.
But anyway, so now we're going to use this stub instead of an actual event publisher. So we can do that by passing in a new event publisher stub into our attached properties class. And that's why interfaces are awesome. And now we could conceivably write some tests that prove that events are being published, but I'm not going to bother with that at the moment. And I'm going to go ahead into my unit test sessions and do a run and see what happens.
That's a lot of red, Nelson.
Yeah, something broke.
You don't say.
Oh, yeah, I'm stupid. Basically, I forgot to initialize the cached value of key, or the cached value indexed by key to actually any value at all. So what I'm going to do is when we register a game object and we register his provider property key, I'm just going to go ahead and say cached values property key equals null, and then run our test again. And sweet. So now we only get one error. So let's go ahead and debug this guy.
It is definitely an improvement.
Ooh, this actually, I think, if this is what I think it is, this is good. Yes, this is the new test we wrote today. So we just actually found a bug that we introduced after we wrote a test that dealt with this bug. So that was really cool. Basically, this bug means that when the instance of a game object that doesn't initially expose a property that is then exposed by an interceptor, it then has that property exposed by an interceptor.
You just jumbled that up so bad, I don't even think I understood what you said. Say that again.
When we have a game object that doesn't initially expose a particular property,
right,
but an interceptor gets attached to it that makes it expose that property, our cached values equals null code doesn't get executed.
Gotcha.
So instead, what we have to do is we have to go down to our attach interceptor. This is the code that executes when a interceptor is attached to a game object that doesn't expose the properties. So what we could do here is that. And then that's kind of ugly. I'll drop that down to its own line. I'll move that up. It's still kind of ugly. Yeah, whatever. Let's go ahead and run our test again.
Yay! All right, good job.
So yeah, so that's me fixing stupid mistakes and code that we haven't or should have implemented but didn't. But yeah.
Do you feel good before I stop so I don't have to do 2 edits tonight?
No, I think I'm good.
Sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Our unit test passed. We're shooting off our genericized property changed event. And yeah, that should be good.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, again, we're going to wrap things up for tonight, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot.